The Vietnam War most affected military recruitment, the influence of young people in government, and new culture in America. The war brought out the best and the worst in America. For one, it made people realize that if you fight for something you really believe in, you can make it happen.
Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest.
College students were the ones to first realize this. They were the future of America, and they were scared of their own government. Something that was reintroduced in the Vietnam War was the draft. In order to be chosen by the draft, you had to be between the age of 18 and 25, and many of these younger people didn't see the point in fighting something that you were against. This caused a rise in the anti-war riots and public demonstrations, many of which turned violent.
And they're dragging everybody right out of the aisle here.
One of the most well-known examples being the Kent State University shootings. 1,000 National Guardsmen were called to the university because of a rally that was set to be held on campus. After a failed attempt to disperse the rally, Guardsmen opened fire, shooting directly into crowds of students and into the air. This event only further spread the word of the anti-war movement and made citizens reevaluate how trusting they could be of their government. Bringing back the draft in the Vietnam War was a very controversial topic. With the huge anti-war movement, many people were simply not willing to fight in a war that they protested in massive parades. Some felt like they didn't have a choice and were sent out to fight even though they didn't actually believe in the cause. Others felt like it was their duty if they were called to fight for their country. Then there were the people that strongly resisted the draft, spreading the word to others that they were just being convinced by government-created propaganda. Many were so hesitant to register for the draft because large numbers of ground troops were being sent directly into Vietnam by Lyndon Johnson and casualties continued to rise. Some view the draft as an unfair lottery to force the lower class into doing the dirty work for the upper class. American forces in Vietnam included 25% poor, 55% working class, and 20% middle class men, but very few came from upper class families. A third of the troops in Vietnam were selected by the draft, so this statistic tells us a lot about how it was poor men fighting a rich man's war. However, there were quite a few well-known famous people that were selected by the draft. Ted Nugent was chosen to be sent to war, but came up with a unique way of getting out of it. Before his physical examination, he took crystal meth, didn't shower for a month, and for a week he used his pants as a bathroom. Call him crazy, but he failed his physical and wasn't sent off to Vietnam. One of the most well-known examples of draft evasion would be Muhammad Ali. He refused to fight in the war because he claimed it was against his Muslim religion. Ali was stripped of his heavyweight title, convicted of draft evasion and sentenced to 5 years in prison, fined $10,000, and banned from boxing for 3 years. All of this was lifted from Ali after his case was appealed and he went on to appear in the fight of the century, where he lost to Joe Frazier after 15 rounds. Although the draft is not in effect today, it is always a possibility. Federal law still requires men ages 18 to 25 to register for a draft that does not exist. Even though our chances of reverting back to the draft are slim, there are major consequences if you do not register. If you're an immigrant, you can be deported. You can lose the opportunity for job training and certain government jobs. You can even be denied financial aid and loans from the government. Coming out of the Cold War, Americans were still on edge because of the Red Scare and Eisenhower's domino theory. When the Soviet Union reached out to Vietnam, it got the attention of the United States. Communism is a very attractive theory, especially to a country like Vietnam. A large portion of their population was poor, so it would make sense for those people to want everything to be equal. No one is higher or lower class than you, and you are guaranteed employment and free medical care through your government. With the domino theory in mind, Vietnam would become a large threat to the countries that surrounded it, and we wouldn't let that happen. At first, there were parades that were actually pro-Vietnam. Then people began to realize what a mistake going into Vietnam was. The anti-war movement started small at first, mainly on college campuses. College students were the ones in the range of age to be chosen by the draft, so they decided to do something about it. The Students for a Democratic Society helped organize more anti-war protests and helped gain attention towards the movement. Many students became more involved in local politics and to try to make an impact. Slowly but surely, more and more of the public began to realize that sending troops into Vietnam wasn't benefiting anyone. That's when the parades went from pro-war to anti-war. Across the country, hundreds of protests and parades with thousands of people erupted, and suddenly support for the war began to fade. Now that the war was in full swing and more people started to have their own opinion of the decisions being made about what to do, it changed the culture of America. One of the big cultures that grew along with the anti-war movement is the hippie movement. This lifestyle became synonymous with American youth of the 1960s. This was a way more relaxed group of people that was interested in peace and the mindset of anti-war. The hippie movement was birthed from the idea of counterculture, which was not to follow in the steps of others and reject any thinking that appears to be illogical. Drug use was a common characteristic of this lifestyle, with many younger people experimenting with the use of marijuana and LSD. Some call this period the Third Great Awakening because of this new method of thought. Keep in mind that the hippie movement was only about 10% of American youth. The majority of young Americans sought to stay in school and pursue a career as a normal person would. Another culture that started to show up frequently was popular culture, which tended to deal with the war indirectly. Such novels as Joseph Heller's Catch-22 and Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five came from pop culture. These are examples of people showing what they think about the US's involvement in the Vietnam War. At that time, almost all of the television and newspaper media was coverage on the war, and certain major events took place such as the Tet Offensive. This definitely shows the country's change of culture because media is the largest thing that determines the interest level of topics. If no one cared about it or it wasn't a hot topic, then it wouldn't be published in the media. As this was given more and more focus from people, the more it changed their views and the more they started to state their opinions, which demonstrated America's culture changing just because of one event. With about 1.3 million deaths, it's clear that this was a bloody war. Many still consider the question if sending troops into Vietnam was really necessary, but it was more an inevitability. Going into the war, a popular idea in America was that communists were the enemy. So when the Soviet Union tried converting other countries to communism, there was no way we would just stand by and watch the whole continent of Asia go communist. It made sense going into the war, but decades later, we can see the damage that was done.